Thank you for joining us this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are, or this morning, possibly. This is Mishnah on Depth, Mishnah Yomit. This class is a project of Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored in her memory by her family. For those of us who have not had the pleasure of learning with Rabbi Silber, he is the dean of the yeshiva and has been so for many years. And this class is a supplement to the Mishnah Yomit learning cycle, where we are continuing through with Yevamot. I will be sharing text from Yevamot on screen, but you are welcome to follow along in your own copies as you wish. If you're able to, I'm going to send down a round of invitations to panelists. If you're able to join, I strongly recommend that, as you can unmute yourself and ask questions directly. But if you are joining us also on Facebook, you are not neglected. Please ask questions in chat. I will bring them to Rabbi Silber's attention. And if you're also on Zoom, please do feel welcome to ask questions in chat, and I will make sure that they come to Rabbi Silber's attention when we pause for questions. And with that, I want to turn things over to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you very much, Kayla. Okay, so today I did want to, hopefully towards the end, we'll begin with one of the major topics of the tractate. There's three major areas in the tractate, but one has to do with aguna. And there are three different chapters in this Masechet that deal with the aguna. Of course, most of the discussion is in the Gemara, the commentaries, and Shulchan Aruch and the works. But the Mishnah typically is a pathway, is a gateway to the study. So that's the point of Mishnah, to begin to allow us to enter into this world. But before we get to aguna, I wanted to make a different point, as relevant to several of the mishnayot in the Masechet. And we will, so let's begin with the pasuk in Sefer Dvarim. The pasuk in Sefer Dvarim, which deals with Yibum, we saw that already in the very beginning. A couple of times we've looked at it. It's all in chapter 25 of Sefer Dvarim. And I just wanted to focus in on one pasuk, actually, which deals with the mitzvah of Yibum. The Torah obviously recommends Yibum. Chalitza, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks, is the alternative to Yibum, which in the Torah, in any event, is disapproved of, but already in the Gemara and beyond the Gemara is not disapproved of. In fact, becomes perhaps even a favorable option in many cases, in most cases. But anyway, in the Chumash, the first pasuk says, brothers live together, yeshvuachim yachdav, and one dies without children, then the woman should not marry somebody outside. Right, that's the first verse. That's verse number 5. And then that's verse number 5. So there's a prohibition of the woman to marry somebody it's not clear, but not echav. Let's use the narrow definition of the Mishnah, which means a brother. She should marry a brother, and not marry someone else who's not a brother. Let's leave it at that. That's the way the Talmud understands it. That's the Mishnah, fine. Now we have the next verse, which is very interesting. The next verse, which the Gemara comments on, and the Mishnah presumes, is the following. It says, Vayaha b'chor asher tered, Yakum al shem achiv hamet, v'lo yimacheh shemo miYisrael. So the plain meaning of the verse clearly is that the oldest child that, in other words, presumably the child that is born to this union, that is the widow of the brother, they die without children, he has no children, and then she marries his brother. When they have a child, that child, the Bechor, the first child, Yakum al Shem Achiv Hamed, shall be accounted to, that's how they translate, not a bad, shall be accounted to the dead brother, in order that his name not be blotted out in Israel. That obviously is the plain meaning of the verse. There can be no question. That's what the verse means. Exactly how that works, how the child that's born is accounted to the dead brother, that's a good question. But however we understand it, that's what the plain meaning of the verse is. The Gemara comments that this is one of those verses, says the Gemara, one of the few verses where mikra yotzei midei pishuto, where the verse is to be interpreted not according to its plain meaning. So the Gemara and Gemara says, and the Mishnah presumes this, has a different interpretation of verse number 6. And I mention this not because I want to get into the whole issue of all these various limudim, if it's the pshat, not the pshat, or whatever, but it's relevant to our study of Mishnah. And that is the way the Mishnah understands it, the Gemara understands it, is the following. It shall, if the brother dies without children, then the Bechor Asher Teled refers not to the child that will be born from this new marriage, but rather refers to the oldest brother. When a brother dies without children, then the oldest of the brothers, let's say there's more than one brother, then the oldest of the brothers, Yakum al Shem Achiv Amet, shall be connected to, shall be related to Shem Achiv Hamet. The word Shem is taken not to mean the name of the brother, but the possession of the brother. You have, for example, in the book of Breshit, when Yaakov speaks to Joseph, his son, he says, your 2 sons are going to be my sons. If you have any other children, Yikaru al Shem Achehem benachvatam. They'll also be included in the inheritance of their brothers. So the Gemara's reading of the verse, which it says straight up, it's not the plain meaning, but we have to interpret here not according to the plain meaning, is that the oldest brother, and that we saw in the Mishnah. The Mishnah spoke about which a man can have many brothers. Which brother is obligated to do the yibum, to which the Mishnah said the oldest brother has the obligation. If another brother did yibum, preempted him, it's valid. They're married. But the obligation, the mitzvah, is on the oldest brother. Now, I'll come to the significance of that in a moment. I want to make a more general point. So that's the way the Gemara understands the verse, and that's what the Mishnah is understanding. The Mishnah that we saw already previously says that yibum, the mitzvah of yibum, devolves first upon the oldest brother. If the oldest brother can't do it, won't do it, doesn't want to do it, whatever, then the next brother can do it. But the mitzvah is the obligation is on the oldest brother. That's the Mishnah we saw already. Now, why do I mention all this? What is the relevance for I mean, it's important in its own right. But it says a man dies with, and he has brothers, right? He has many brothers. So the point is, she shouldn't marry somebody else, suggests there's a particular person she's supposed to marry. And according to the understanding now of the verse, it's the oldest brother. Right. But here there's a very important point about Yibum and about Tractate Yevamot and about marriage generally speaking. And that's the following. Marriage is about the relationship between these two parties. They are married, and there's something called ishut. There's a relationship between them, and the woman is forbidden to marry anybody else, according to the Mishnah and the Gemara. And there are all kinds of mutual responsibilities. And the responsibilities are not just personal responsibilities, but they are financial responsibilities. One can never lose sight of the fact that marriage is not just a personal relationship. It involves all kinds of personal stuff, but it also is a financial arrangement. Now, the financial arrangement between a husband and wife is not the main province of Tractate Yevamot. The financial arrangements of husband and wife is actually the next tractate, Tractate Ketuvot. And that is actually a fascinating tractate for many reasons. But that's where the Mishnah, and of course the Gemara, lays out all kinds of financial mutual responsibilities. We can never lose sight of the financial side. And the Rambam, when he codifies this in his Hilchot Ishut, Rambam was very logical, it's developed logically. The Rambam says straight up, the man has 10 obligations towards his wife, and the woman has 4 obligations towards her husband. And these are obligations, and some of them are actually reciprocal obligations, as we'll get to. But I just want to point that out because, first of all, we're talking about Yibum in terms of the marriage itself, but the marriage, standard marriage, has financial obligations. The main financial obligation of a standard marriage, this is relevant as we continue our study to the next tractate, but the main financial obligation is called the ketuvah. That is to say, a man marries a woman, and he has to give her a ketuvah. And the ketuvah consists of a series of obligations that the husband has towards the wife. Not just that in the case of death or divorce, she gets X amount of money. Is it a first marriage, not a first marriage, and all that stuff. But there are all kinds of other obligations as well. For example, one of the interesting obligations in the ketuvah, and this is not our main topic here, but I want to point this out. It comes up in the Mishnah here too, is, for example, in the event that she is kidnapped, she's taken hostage, there's an obligation upon the man to redeem his wife. Maybe an obligation upon the community generally, but the first obligation is on the man to redeem his wife. Now, how much he has to pay for it and all that, that's a question about hostages in general, which has been much discussed lately, obviously. But that's one of the obligations, one of the 10 obligations. And the woman has certain obligations as well. There's a financial arrangement here. And I mention all this because I wanted, before we get to the aguna stuff, which will start hopefully later this morning, afternoon, or whatever time it is, I wanted to look at, for example, a Mishnah in chapter 7, Mishnah number 1. There's certain concepts here that the Mishnah mentions, which are very important to know for our general knowledge, because they come up time and time again in many contexts. And here's one of those. You have in chapter 7, Mishnah number 1. Mishnah says the following. The Mishnah has a case where a couple is married, but the marriage is actually illicit. It's a forbidden marriage. So, for example, almana l'kohen gadol, gerusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot. If the high priest marries a widow, the high priest is not permitted to marry a widow. He's not permitted to marry a widow. A standard priest is not permitted to marry a divorced woman, a gerusha, or a woman that has chalitza. Chalitza may be only a rabbinic prohibition. It doesn't matter for our purposes. In any event, there's a marriage which should not have taken place on the books, but in fact, if they did get married, they are married. That's the point of the Mishnah. They are actually married, as opposed to the list of incestuous relationships where there's no marriage. Okay, this we've discussed already in several mishnayot. Amar l'kohen gadol, gerusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot, says the Mishnah in chapter 7. Ichnisa lo avdei mulug v'avdei tzon barzel. Avdei mulug lo yochlu b'truma. Avdei tzon barzel yochlu. Now, what does this mean? So when the couple gets married, so the man has an obligation. Primary is ketuvah. He can also add to the ketuvah. The ketuvah is the minimum amount of money. But the Mishnah talks about, in the 5th chapter of ketuvot, what if the man says, I want to give you more money? I'll give you additional money for the ketuvah. That's called the tosefet ketuvah. And the tosefet ketuvah has the same rule as a ketuvah, generally speaking. Of course, there are exceptions to that. But so he can add $1 million. Yes, ketuvah is 200 zuz. I'll make it 1,200,000. That's called the tosefet ketuvah. Fine. Now, when the woman marries the man, she may bring property into the marriage. That property is called a nudunya. We call it dowry. And it depends what kind of property she brings in. Generally speaking, there are 2 categories of property that the woman can bring into the marriage. And the Mishnah here references them. And they actually have all kinds of interesting rules. One of them is called nichse melug, mem lamed vav gimel. And the other is called nichse tzon barzel, iron sheep. Iron sheep and nichse melug. Melug in Hebrew means to pluck. The difference is the following. That nichse melug means that, let's say the woman brings in $1,000 into the marriage. Doesn't matter what the amount is. And she says, this is nichse melug. It's my money. That's nichse melug, is her money. But he has the use of the money. He can use the money. In the case of death or divorce, whatever let's say she brought a piece of property into the marriage. It's worth $1,000. And he works the fields, and he has the fruit of the fields is his. That's called nichsei merug. Then he dies 10 years later, or divorced, whatever. And now they have this piece of property, which was $1,000 when they got married. The piece of property went up in value. It's worth $5,000. So if it's nichsei merug, that $5,000 goes to her. It's her property. He had the use of the property. He owned it to the extent he could use it, but it's not his property. So therefore, it's her property. And whatever, if there was a loss, it's her loss. If there's a gain, it's her gain. That's called nichsei merug. Nichsei tzon barzel is different. Nichsei tzon barzel means she gives him the property. It's his property. But there's an IOU on the property. That is to say, whatever the value was at the time of marriage is the value. So let's say it's $1,000 piece of property, and then he divorced, and later on, it's $3,000. He writes her a check for $1,000, and he keeps the property for himself. And if it goes down in value, it's only worth $100 now. He also writes a check for $1,000. That's all nichsei tzon barzel. So the interesting thing is that it's not just two different formulations. It could actually be that there's a big difference between these two things. One of them fundamentally, you could say, is his. Tzon barzel fundamentally is his. Nichsei merug is very interesting because nichsei merug on one hand is hers. On the other hand, he does have the use of the property. So one of the big questions in the Talmud, not about nichsei merug, but in general, is if someone owns property and someone else has the right to use it, what kind of legal standing does the one who has the right to use it have? That's known in the jargon of the Gemara as kinyan peirot. And there's a whole big fight in the Gemara, disagreement, whether how much ownership, the very fact that you have the use of it gives you. That's not our problem over here. In any event, these are two different kinds of property, two different kinds of things the woman brings into the marriage. The Mishnah here is talking about a different situation. The Mishnah is talking about the following case. The marriage was illicit to start with, but they are married. Remember that. They are actually married. They shouldn't have been married. It's forbidden, but they're married. And now she brought into the marriage, she owns slaves. She owns avadim. But the avadim, and now she comes into the marriage and she's bringing this property, which is the human property, slaves, into the marriage. And it depends how they are looked at. She makes that determination. If in fact they're avdei merug, okay, now she's married to a Kohen illicitly, okay. So in this case, if it's avdei merug, says the Mishnah, avdei merug lo yochu b'truma. The avdei merug, which are her slaves, may not eat truma. Remember, we saw that in this mishnayot. I'm sure you've seen this. That in many of the mishnayot talks about eating truma. The eating truma is simply a barometer of the state of marriage. So in this particular case, if she's married to a Kohen, she's not allowed to eat truma. Why is she not allowed to eat truma? Because she becomes, when living with the Kohen, since it's forbidden, she becomes called a chalala. A chalala may not eat truma. Since she can't eat truma, her possessions can't eat truma either. So therefore, the Mishnah says they are married, but her servants, her slaves, may not eat truma. However, what about his slaves? Avdei tzon barzel, because that formulation is he actually owns them, not just the right to use, but he owns them with an IOU. So avdei tzon barzel, right? Avdei merug go yochu b'truma. Avdei tzon barzel yochu. Okay. Now the Mishnah explains the difference between avdei merug and avdei tzon barzel. Elohein avdei merug, they call it merog. Anyway, im metu la, im hotiru la. Afal pishu chayabim zonatan, harei elu lo yochu b'truma. So the Mishnah explains. Mishnah says, as I mentioned before, what's the difference between them? The difference is avdei merug, that kind of property. If they die, if the slave dies, then that is her loss. She lost the slave because they're hers. If the slave went up in value, her benefits. Now, even though he is obligated to feed them, because they are married, and he has the obligation to feed her and to feed them as well, apparently, because that's true. So they're his in the sense they're his possessions to the degree he has a responsibility to feed them. However, that doesn't make them his possessions in terms of eating truma. That's what the Mishnah says. And the Mishnah goes on to explain what Avdei Tzon Barzel are. In make to go. Avdei Tzon Barzel, his loss. Imotiru lo, or his gain. Since he's responsible for them, they're his. He's a Kohen. The Kohen's possessions eat truma. She may not eat truma because she becomes disqualified. She becomes a halala. But the Avdei Tzon Barzel are essentially his. The Gemara actually has a discussion, which is not our province here, but the Gemara discusses whether, in fact, the Avdei Mulug, Mishnah says the Avdei Mulug are hers and they can't eat truma. The Gemara discusses whether that is actually the real rule or a kind of knas or a kind of fine. Maybe even though they're hers, but they're also his. After all, they do work for him. After all, he owns the field. He owns them to the extent that he gets a benefit from them. Is that enough in principle to give them truma or not? That's the Talmud discusses. But I mentioned this Mishnah for a different reason, which is I want to point out that what you have over here in marriage and with the Yavam as well, it's not just a personal relationship. There are all kinds of financial obligations, mutual obligations of one to the other. We'll come to this later on in the Mishnah we get to, I hope, later on. Let me stop for 1 second here. Are there any comments and questions of what we've seen so far?
And if you are not able to unmute yourself because you're an attendee, I can unmute you. Just let me know in chat. Any takers?
No takers. Okay. No takers. Okay, let's continue then. Now, I wanted to, before we continue to another Mishnah in Yevamot, I want us to jump to a different Mishnah altogether. That happens sometimes with the mishnayot, that you discover in one tractate something that you think maybe might be appropriate for a different tractate, just the way it gets organized. And there's a very interesting Mishnah in of all places, tractate called Bechorot. Bechorot is a fascinating tractate. It's found in Seder Kodshim, and Bechorot deals with several different interesting issues. One is the whole discussion about mum, about blemish. The Torah says that a blemished animal may not be brought as a sacrifice, and a blemished Kohen may not work in the temple. And the Tractate Yevamot deals at length with what is defined as a blemish and not a blemish. That's one thing. I'm not dealing with that at all. It's not a topic. Then it deals with Bechor in the last chapter over here in two different senses. Because Bechor comes up in two different places in the Torah. And the Mishnah, of course, which has a very broad view of everything, talks about the two of them and compares the two. And the two are the following. One is that a male, if a woman gives birth to a boy, first boy, that boy is called the Bechor, and there's a rule of Pidyon Haben. Under those circumstances, it's an obligation upon the father to give 5 coins to the priest to redeem his son. Now, he's not actually redeeming his son. It's not if you don't give the 5 coins, the son is sent away or something. No, it's not understood that way. But it's conceptually that the first belongs to God, and you give the 5 shekels to the Kohen as a kind of, in principle, replacement for. In fact, at the ceremony of the Pidyon Haben, the Kohen asked the father, "What do you want? Do you want the 5 coins, or do you want your son?" But it's not a real question. It's not a real question. And those who are my age may remember the Jack Benny show. Jack Benny was a comedian. He was on radio and on TV, and he was a very stingy guy, And one time the robber tells him, in one of the shows, "Give me your money or I'll shoot you in 2 legs." And Benny's response is, how about 1 leg? So for Benny, if he asked him the question, 5 shekels or your son, he would have a tough time answering that question. But for most people, it's not actually a question. So that's one. That's a halacha called pidyon haben. That's the bechar. Then there's another din of bechar, which is that the bechar gets an extra portion of the inheritance. If a man dies and has children, the oldest child gets what's called pishnayim, gets a double portion. Okay, so those are the 2 rules in the Chumash about the bechar, and the Mishnah in the last chapter of Becharot, chapter number, I take it back, it's not the last chapter, it's chapter number 8. The last chapter is 9, but in chapter 8, it talks about these 2 situations. It compares and contrasts them, which the Mishnah likes to do. That's not our province here. But what is interesting here, in chapter 8, Mishnah number 9, we have the following. It says, HaBechar notel pishnayim b'nichsei ha'av. V'yeinu notel pishnayim b'nichsei ha'im. Okay, the Bechar gets a double portion in the father's property, but not the mother's property. None of this is our province over here. V'yeinu notel pishnayim b'shvach v'lo b'roi ki b'muchzak. This is a different rule about the inheritance of Bechar. Bechar gets a double portion in general, but not in 2 things. Does not get a double portion in the accrued interest, in the accrued benefit that came to the property that upon the death of the parent, let's say. And the parent dies, let's say, February 1, and then the estate is taken care of 6 months later. The increased value of the property between the time of death and the division of the property, in that, if there's an increment in an additional value, he doesn't get pishnayim. He doesn't get an extra portion in that. His extra portion is only the property that exists at the time of death, nor but roi. Roi means if the deceased had money coming in, had debts that were coming due later, but they're not presently in the estate, he doesn't get a double portion in that either. It's not our province. It's an interesting halacha. But I mentioned this Mishnah for a different reason. It says, V'lo ha'isha b'ktuvata. Let's leave that out. A woman doesn't collect this in the ketuvah. Lo banot, v'lo hayavam. And the yavam does not get an extra portion in these things as well. In other words, the death of his brother, okay, if there were other monies owed, let's say, to the brother, or perhaps another scenario could be if the father died and the brother's supposed to get property from the father and the brother dies, okay, or the brother died first and the father died afterwards. Well, these are both scenarios the Talmud discusses. But the point of the Mishnah, and the point I'm making, is that this is what the Yavam does not get. But what the Yavam does get is the brother's portion. So in other words, we talk about Yibum all this time. We talk about the obligation to marry the wife of the deceased, etc., to build the family of the deceased, and all that. All that's true. And the prohibition of the woman to marry someone outside, and the requirement for how do you terminate this if there was chalitza. What about if a get is given? And what about kedushin during this time for mamar? All that is in the Mishnah. We discussed some of that. But there's another point we should not forget. The brother inherits his brother. The brother gets his brother's portion. In other words, a Yavam inherits his brother. Normally speaking, how does it normally work? If a brother dies, okay, who inherits a brother? So there's a whole chapter in Bava Batra that the way it works, there's an order of inheritance. And prior to the brothers inheriting, actually the father inherits. A child inherits the father, and the father inherits the child. That comes first. If there is no father, then the brothers. So the point is, but the Yavam, right? The Yavam gets his brother's property. When the Yavam does Yibum, he then takes his brother's place, not just his brother's place in terms of the wife, but he takes the brother's place in terms of the property. I just wanted to point this out, because we've been dealing the whole time with the relationship of the wife and Yivam Ashuk and all that. But there is a big financial side to all this, and that is found in the Mishnah in Bechorot, actually, which tells you what the Yavam does not get. But by clear implication, it's what the Yavam does get. And now we understand actually something else about the Mishnah, which says that the obligation devolves upon the oldest brother. Because the point is, the Mishnah that we saw only talked about what if he doesn't want to do it. But actually, there is an incentive to do it. The incentive is a big financial incentive, that he actually collects the brother's property. And there's something else I want to mention as well. The main obligation that in marriage, primary, there are many other obligations, but the primary obligation, financial, is called the ketuvah. The Talmud has a big fight, big debate as to whether the idea of the ketuvah comes from the Torah or it's a rabbinic invention. And in fact, not only does the Talmud have a debate, but the commentaries on the Talmud have a big fight. The Rambam says that ketuvah is a rabbinic instrument. Ketuvah is drabanan. And the Rabbi, who disagrees with the Rambam, says that's not the case, and many agree with the Rabbi, that ketuvah is a Torah obligation. In the case of Yibum, the ketuvah that the woman has a right to is the former husband's obligation. It's not the Yavam's obligation. The primary obligation, if the money is there and all that, the primary obligation falls upon the deceased husband. So my point is that, more broadly speaking, I think it's very important to point this out. There are all kinds of financial implications. We'll see some more in a few minutes of this Yibum situation. And let me stop here and take any comments or questions.
There is one question I want to bring up in chat from Evelyn. Yes. Evelyn, let me know if I got this right. Does the Havok get Prishnayim if he does Yivam for his brother who is a Bechor? Evelyn, can you clarify what you meant by Havok?
Does the person who's doing the Yibam get Pishnayim if he's doing it for the wife of the Bechor in the family who died?
Right. So the Pishnayim in the case of the Yibum situation is not the same as the Bechor. By Pishnayim just means he gets two portions. See, the way it usually works,
from his brother.
Let's say there is 6 brothers. There's a Bechor and 5 brothers. And the way it works normally with a normal inheritance is you divide the estate into 7 pieces. The first brother gets 2 pieces and the others get 1 piece. He doesn't get twice as much as everybody else. He gets an extra portion. So the Yavam, in taking his brother's portion, is getting Pishnayim. It's similar to a Bechor, but it's not this, whatever the brother had. You're asking if the brother was a Bechor and he already got his double portion. I suppose the Yavam does inherit his brother. So whatever the Yavam would get, the brother gets. That's true. Right. But I'm saying, but the Pishnayim, the normal case, not talking about the Bechor. It just means a Yavam gets his own portion and he takes his brother's portion too. So he has 2 portions. Maybe there are 12 brothers. He gets 2 and the others just get 1. Yeah. Any other questions? I mean, it's an incentive to do Yibum because you get all this extra property. Right. Okay. Now let's take a look at another Mishnah here. Let's take a look at Mishnah. Let's find this chapter 9, Mishnah 3. And then we'll get to the Aguna today. We'll start Aguna next week. Okay. Chapter 9, Mishnah 3. Chapter 9 is typical of the Mishnah in general. Let's just back up for a moment to chapter 9, Mishnah 1, just for a second. Just to back up for a moment to Mishnah number 1. Because this is very typical of the language of the Mishnah. First, yesh mutarot lebalehen vasurot liyivmeyen. Mutarot liyivmeyen vasurot lebalehen. Mutarot le'elu ve'elu vasurot le'elu ve'elu. So the first Mishnah says there are situations where the couple, the initial couple, right, there's a case where the woman is permitted to, the man and woman can marry each other, but she will be forbidden to marry the Yavam. It'll be an illicit relationship. Yet you could have the other way around. There's a case where she can marry the Yavam, but she should not have married her husband. And there are cases, of course, where she can marry either of the two. And there are cases where she will be forbidden to either of the two. And the Mishnah then sets out, give you a whole bunch of cases where the woman, where the first marriage was illegal, but the Yibum would be okay. Where the first marriage was legal, but the Yibum would be not okay, where both are okay, which is obvious, and where both will be forbidden. So that's this. We see this all the time in the Mishnah, that this kind of a structure. And the question is, what to make of these structures? I just want to digress for 2 minutes. I had an interesting conversation last night about the Mishnah. One thing you have in the Mishnah has many of these structures. If you learn Mishnah, the more you learn, the more you will see constantly these structures. And you will also find something else very often in the Mishnah, which is they will say, there are 4 ways to do this, there are 5 ways to do this, there are 6 cases of that, there are 4 cases of this, etc. And the question that's been discussed, and I think even assumed as true, is that these kinds of things are important because, or useful, because remember, the Mishnah originally was not written down. This is Torah Sheba'al Peh. At some point it gets written down. But these rules, which actually predate the Mishnah, exist before the Mishnah. And the Mishnah talks about people that would simply speak and tell over the rules. It would talk over the rules. So the theory was that this idea of having 3 and 4 and 2 and 1 and these kinds of categories were essentially useful for memory. That these were actually done this way in order that people could in fact remember these mishnayot. That's the theory that's been out there. I've come across it multiple times. But a conversation I had last night raised the question whether this is actually true. Do these things actually help for memory or not? And there's a lot of apparently recent research which suggests this does not help for memory at all. There are other things that help for memory. It came up in the context of a conversation I was having about the mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah. The mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah, which is the 613th commandment, there's virtually very little sources in the Talmud. There's one Gemara. King has to write a Sefer Torah, but every Jew, in theory, is to write a Sefer Torah. At least every man. It's not clear whether the woman has an obligation, but of course, it's virtually impossible to do that. So there's a whole discussion. And the source for that is the verse towards the end of the Torah, Kitvu lochem et hashira hazot. Write down this song, referring to Hazinu. And the Gemara understands it, and the commentaries understand it to read not just Hazinu, but to write the Torah. So with that context of Kitvu lochem et hashira hazot, began to have a conversation about memory. Because one way that we remember things is when we sing. When you sing something, I was a Baal Koreh for many years, and at one point I knew virtually all Torah by heart. And the reason was because I remember when I would learn the Torah, and you sort of remember the tunes. And we all know that things that you sing, you can remember better. So singing or chanting, maybe the chanting of the Talmud, maybe the chanting of the Mishnah, or whatever, possibly could be a memory aid. But are these other structures memory aids or not? And I was told that actually the recent research suggests there's nothing to do with memory. It has to do with something else, by just setting up these structures to understand them better, to clarify. But it is certainly the case, whatever one makes of this, and it's generally assumed it's for memory. But the question was raised yesterday, and I have my doubts about the memory side of it. But in any event, this is a typical structure of the Mishnah. I pointed out because if you're studying the Mishnah, you get involved in this mishnayot, and you do a lot of Mishnah, you'll come across this all the time. So there are some that are this, there were different rules for each one. What's interesting is when you get to the third Mishnah, Mishnah number 3, which is chapter 9, Mishnah 3, and chapter 9, Mishnah 3 says the following. We came across this earlier. I'm trying to pick up on mishnayot that we've already somehow had some connection to, because these are very important concepts. And the concept is called shniyot. Now, remember, what are shniyot? Shniyot, sheni means 2 or second. Shniyot are relationships that are permissible from the Torah, but are rabbinically forbidden. So there's a whole list. There were 20 of them. There are 20 relationships that are forbidden only rabbinically. From the Torah, they're not considered forbidden relationships. The Mishnah here says, and I chose these Mishnah for a reason, Mishnayot b'divrei sofrim. What about a situation where the couple is forbidden to marry, not from the Torah? It's not a sister or something like that. It's not an aunt. It's a shniya. It's a secondary relationship. So here we have the following case. Shniya labal, lo shniya layavam. If you could have a case where the woman is related to the husband as a shniya, he dies, and the yavam is not related to her. He's not a shniya. Asura labal muteret layavam. In that case, she's forbidden to marry the husband, but she married him and they're married. But now she's permitted to the yavam. Shniya la yavam v'lo shniya la baal. If on the other hand, she's forbidden to the yavam, but not to the husband, it's obvious. Asura la yavam umuteret la baal. Shniya la zev la. If she's forbidden to both of them, she's the shniya for both. Asura la zev la. Fine. This is obvious, right? But now the continuation of the Mishnah is very interesting. In the event they got married, ein lo ketuva, v'lo peirot, v'lo mizonot, v'lo bilaot. Havlad kosher, the kofin oto, scroll down, lahotzi. Fine. Now, what the Mishnah says is, what if they in fact got married? These are secondary relatives. So you can read the translation. With regard to secondary relatives, if you scroll down, you'll see. Scroll down a bit. Who are forbidden by rabbinic law. If the woman is a secondary relative to the husband, but not to the yavam, forbidden to the husband, permitted to the yavam. Keep scrolling down. If she is, right. Conversely, she's a relative to the yavam, but not to the husband. She's forbidden to the yavam, permitted to the husband. Forbidden to both, she's secondary to both, forbidden. Now, furthermore, this is what's interesting. Furthermore, if a man marries a woman forbidden to him as a secondary relative, she does not have the right to receive payment for a ketubah. She has no ketubah. They're married, but she's forbidden rabbinically to marry him, as opposed to, for example, the case the Mishnah gave before that we saw, a divorcee marrying a Kohen. The Torah says the Kohen is not permitted to marry the divorcee. She's not permitted to marry the Kohen. Okay? But he did marry her. They got married, whatever. In that case, she has a ketubah. Upon death or divorce, and we want him to divorce her, she has a ketubah. But in this case, from the Torah, they're permitted to marry. It's a secondary prohibition, which is only rabbinic. In this case, there are more penalties. We'll see this. It's an intro to the aguna business. Aguna has something similar to this, which we'll get to. So she dotted out the payment for the produce of her property that he used. And what does that mean? So it means the following: they're married. It's a secondary. It's forbidden relationship as a shniya. Okay. Now we saw that the husband is permitted to use her property. Typically, it's her property, but he can get the benefit from the property. Remember that? That's called nichsei malug. And that's the standard property she brings into the marriage, nichsei malug. Now, the case of the Mishnah is, what about, so he's been using the property for the last 2 years. Then they gained divorce. Now, normally speaking, he used the property, he returns the property to her, and that's it. He doesn't have to pay her back for the stuff, the benefit he got. He's entitled to that. He's entitled to the use. That's called kinyan peirot. He's entitled to the use. But in this particular case, the Mishnah says, you might think he's not entitled for the following reason. It's the reason I mention this, because many of the obligations in the ketuvah are reciprocal obligations. Why, in fact, does he have the right? Why does it's maybe even in Mishnah? It's certainly in the Gemara. Why does he have the right to get benefit from her property? It's her property. Why can he use it in it without paying her? He should have to pay her. He doesn't have to pay her because he has a reciprocal obligation. I believe the reciprocal in this case is that if she actually taken hostage, he has to redeem her. But in the case of a forbidden marriage, he doesn't have that obligation because there's all kinds of penalties about this secondary forbidden marriage. So you would think, actually, and since in this case he has no obligation to her, therefore he's not entitled to get benefit from her property. He should have to reimburse her because everything he took was actually illegal in the sense that he has no mutual reciprocal obligation. That's what the Mishnah says. Though we penalize her in this case, for in this case, he doesn't even have to restore the property, the profit that he made from using her property, which he should not have used because he doesn't have a reciprocal obligation. Okay. Then the Mishnah has a whole bunch of these cases. So she's not entitled to that, right? She's not entitled to get back her worn clothes. In other words, normally in the case where, let's say, nichse tzon barzel, she brings in certain things to the marriage. Those things, normally speaking, when the marriage terminates, he has to reimburse, because remember those things actually belong to her. So the clothing is her clothing. If it was worth $1,000, gives her back $1,000. But in this case, the penalties. In this case, he doesn't have to do such a thing. He just can give her back the clothing the way it is. It's worn out. It's worth half of what it was worth. Fine. So this is what's interesting. The reason I mention this over here, apart from the fact that it once again reinforces the idea, there's a whole financial side to all this. But I want to make a different point about the Mishnah. The Mishnah, and this is something you have in the Talmud in many places, there's more penalties in this case for the forbidden rabbinic marriage than there is for the forbidden Torah marriage. Man marries a woman, it's forbidden to marry, but they are married. Kohen marries a Drisha. Kohen Gadol marries an Almana. Shouldn't do it, but they are actually married, and he has obligations. Those obligations are not lifted. He's got to pay the ketuvah. I don't want to get to all the specifics of it, but fundamentally he's obligated. And fundamentally, in the case over here, he's not obligated. And that's what the Talmud says in many places, that the rabbis gave what they called chizuk. They wanted to strengthen the rabbinic laws because people wouldn't take them as seriously. So Rabbanan asu chizuk l'divrayim yoter mishal Torah. That's a concept we have in many places in the Talmud. And here, right back here in the Mishnah, in chapter 9 of Yevamot, we have exactly this concept. So let's keep this in mind. Sometimes there are all kinds of provisions, penalties, that are put in place to buttress a rule which is problematic in the sense that people might not take it seriously. We're concerned about that. Now, the reason I mention this is, apart from general knowledge, to know that this idea appears in many places, but actually it appears in another place, which is an introduction to the Aguna business, which is the next Mishnah. Aguna is found in 3 chapters in this tractate deal with Aguna. They're not one after the other, by the way, but they're 3 different chapters. And here's the point about the Aguna. Let's just start with the Mishnah in chapter 10, which is the Aguna, one of the Aguna chapters. Unfortunately, a relevant topic nowadays, but shouldn't be, but it is. Now, let's start chapter 10, Mishnah number 1. Let's begin with this. The Mishnah says, the case is where a woman's husband went overseas. It's not like going overseas today. You take a plane, you fly back. Going overseas means far away, maybe inaccessible. We don't know exactly what happened. They came and told her, Meit Palech. They came and told her. Now, it's not clear who the they is over here. We'll get to that next week. They told her, your husband has died. Who is the they? We'll get to that. It's very important. Then he said, okay, my husband died. Sorry to hear it. He's dead. Okay. So she remarries. Makes sense? Then he said, and then the husband shows up. This is the standard Aguna case. Nowadays, we talk about aguna, about men who refuse to give their wives get. It's also aguna, but that's different. We're not talking about that over here. We're talking about what is the standard case. A man disappears, and is in this case with somebody tells the wife, your husband has died. So in good faith, okay, sorry, whatever. And then she remarries, and then he shows up. So in that case, we have a problem because she's married to she was married to Reuven, then she married Shimon, but she's not allowed to marry Shimon. She's a married woman. And a married woman who sleeps with somebody else is forbidden to her husband and forbidden to the other fellow. Those are the rules on the books. So in this case, Teitze mizeh umizeh. She can't live with either husband. She can't go back to the first husband because she had a so-called affair with the second husband, even though it doesn't seem to be her fault. But that's what happened. Utzricha get mizeh umizeh, and both are required to give her a get, because we don't understand why the second guy has to give her a get, because the second guy was never married to her, turns out. But that's what the Mishnah says. We obligate both of them to give her a get. V'ein lo ketuva, v'lo peirot, v'lo mezonot, v'lo bulot, v'lo al zeh, v'lo al zeh. So the Mishnah has severe penalties for this woman. First of all, both have to give her a get, but she gets a ketuva from neither man, not from the first husband, nor from the second. She has no peirot. She's not getting reimbursed for any peirot that the second guy, let's say, ate her peirot, but he wasn't entitled to. Neither one is required to mezonot, to pay for her. Normally, the husband has an obligation to provide food for the wife. That's a whole discussion, but that's the normal case. Very often that doesn't apply, but that's the normal case. Mezonot. We saw her clothing. She shouldn't get back the clothing. She doesn't get back. She doesn't get reimbursed for the loss of the clothing. In other words, the Mishnah has severe penalties here for this woman who would appear from the Mishnah did not act in bad faith. And not only that, but later in the Mishnah it says, Havlad mamzer mizeh umizeh. If the second husband had a child, right? Havlad mamzer mizeh umizeh, which is a very puzzling statement. We understand why the Vlad would be a mamzer from the second guy. If the second husband and the woman produce a child, that child is a mamzer because the woman is married to somebody else. But for the life of us, we can't understand what it means that it's a mamzer from the first husband. Does it mean if he takes her back, it's a mamzer? And so it should not be a mamzer because she's married to the first guy. There's some kind of a penalty under certain circumstances. If she returns to him, then that child would be, rabbinically speaking, a mamzer. Now, my point is, you have in the Mishnah here very severe penalties, and it goes on. These are known in the lingo as the 13 penalties. And for the life of us, it's hard to know why these penalties have been imposed. We'll discuss this next week. But my point is, here you have an interesting situation. And let me say the following, without getting to the specifics of this Mishnah, because the Mishnah is not really clear. The Gemara has an interpretation of the Mishnah. But let me just make the following observation, and we'll have to pick this up next week, which is this. The case of Aguna is the classical case of where the rabbis decide that we are going to bend the rules to allow this woman to remarry. We will see next week that actually, by the book, in most of these cases, the woman would not be permitted to actually get married again. She can only get married again if you have solid evidence that the husband has died. We'll talk about that next week. What does solid evidence mean? But the way it works is that the rabbis decided, there's a debate amongst them. We'll see a dispute. It's not one voice. But the fundamental position that one position in the Mishnah and one that is accepted over time is that in the case of the Aguna, we bend the rules to allow the woman to remarry them. we bend the rules to a degree, I think it's fair to say, that most of the great halachic decisors over time, they bend them to a point you can barely recognize them. But the point is, they're bending over backwards, triple somersaults, to allow this woman to remarry, which I think is the spirit of the mishnayot. But having said that, therefore, we have on the other side these penalties. Because in the case that it's not so, dafka because we're going out of our way to bend the rules, then we have in this case as well all these penalties, which remind us very much of what we just saw in the case of the shniyot, of the forbidden relationship of secondary relationship, which is from the Torah permissible. But in the case of shniyot, there are all kinds of penalties if they did it, and which don't apply in the case where it's forbidden from the Torah. Here as well, in the case of aguna, we have an interesting idea over here, which comes up in many mishnayot, and we'll start next week with this. And that is that on one hand, we have all kinds of tremendous leniencies when it comes to aguna. On the other side of it, we will encounter in the Mishnah things that appear to be extremely harsh and extremely, difficult stringencies in terms of the permissibility to remarry. So we will encounter this next time. Just wanted to begin with the aguna, which is, again, 3 chapters in Yevamot about aguna. The first is chapter 10. That'll be our topic for next week as well. Let me stop here and ask, are there any comments or questions about anything that we discussed now?
Yes, Evelyn.
Yeah, so all these cases that we've gone through, initially we just discussed forbidden relationships, but then there's a whole section in these last number of prakim that deals with people who have gone into relationships that are not right, and they go into it anyhow. And what do you do after that? It just, if I take a larger look at that, it just seems to me that this society that they're describing here is like off base totally.
Right.
And that,
Right.
I don't get it.
I don't think it's that. I'll tell you what I think it is. I think, and this is true in general about the Mishnah. But we try, remember the Gemara Yevamot, the first 5 chapters which deal with these cases, there are 4 brothers, 2 are married to sisters. And some of these cases are so unlikely. And the Gemara, in other words, I think you have to think of it this way. This is in one form or another. It's not just an anthology. I think it is a legal document in some sense. And what interests the Mishnah, and what the Mishnah chooses to focus in on very often, on those cases, we could call them liminal cases. There are cases that are just on the boundaries, on the borders of something. Is it legal? Is it illegal? On cases that are very odd cases, they bring out an interesting principle. I see it in that spirit. I don't think it's a reflection of society. I think it's a reflection of the struggle to create this legal code. And they're trying to look at the Chumash, which is not a legal code. The Chumash does have halachot, but it's certainly not a complete legal code. And someone, Rabbi, is actually looking at the history of the Torah Shabbat Peh and putting together this amazing compilation, which tries to deal with everything and try to build a system out of a book which is 80% stories. And I think that the way the system is built on cases that are actually on the boundaries. But I don't think it reflects any kind of reality. Some of those cases in Yevamot are extraordinarily unlikely to ever take place. The 4 brothers, and the Gemara has even more complicated case. The 6 brothers. I mean, so the fact of the matter is, I don't see it that way. I don't see it as reflecting society. I see it more as picking these cases, which are interesting cases, because they're actually cases that are right on the boundaries, and they force you actually to bring into play very often conflicting ideas and to try to arrive, because these cases are more complicated. They require us to think about all sides of a case. For example, the case in the Chumash about when 2 men are fighting and they strike, it would appear by accident, a pregnant woman, and it's not clear, and something happened. It's not clear what happened. Was there a miscarriage? Was there? No. The woman is injured. The woman dies. Now, the case is an unlikely case. So there you have a case of 2 people who don't intend to harm a third party, but they do. Then you have a case of the fetus over there, and it's not clear who pays, what are you paying for, and it's certainly not intentional. In other words, you have a case over there. The Chumash picks this case out because the case has, and the Talmud discusses at great length all different possibilities. It's not that cases are so likely to happen, but it's the Mishnah is in that spirit. They pick these cases, so we of course it's going to pick cases on the boundary, and the boundaries are boundary between what is legal and what is illegal. That's one of the main boundaries we have. So you have all these cases, and the Gemara is trying to figure out. You have a whole list of forbidden relationships, and the Gemara says, well, we have to draw distinctions. Sometimes there's no marriage. Sometimes there is forbidden, but there is a marriage. Sometimes it's permissible from the Torah and forbidden rabbinically. And what the Mishnah is interested in doing is laying out, create all in front of us, then trying to figure out what is the best approach. What do we care more about? What are we more concerned about societally, for example? We're more worried maybe about the rabbinic relationships because people are more likely to violate them. The other stuff's unlikely. So I'm saying I don't necessarily think it's a very important question that you're raising, I think, but I don't see it as reflecting the actual society. I see it more as just a mechanism to try to get to some sort of legal thinking and to give you cases where there are all different sides to a problem. Let's leave it at that for now. Next week we'll pick up with Aguna. It's a good question, but I'll stop you at this point. So next week we'll tackle some of the Aguna mishnayot. Okay, thank you all.
All right. Thank you. And if we weren't able to get to your question, Rabbi Silber, where can people get in touch with you?
Are there more questions?
I just saw that Nathan had his hand up, and I wasn't sure if that question got answered.
I'll take one more question now, and I'll stop. What's the question?
Thank you. Have you answered for why mizeh mamzerim, or is it left open as a question for why that is a scripture?
Maybe next week we'll talk about it. It's a penalty. I mean, let's put it. I said it's a penalty. Why specifically this kind of penalty? And it doesn't seem to make that much sense. Why is it a mamzer from the first guy? The first guy is a totally legitimate marriage. So we'll talk about that next week. You can raise it next week. But I'm saying there are a series of very severe penalties. That was my point. Severe penalties in a case which it doesn't seem to warrant it at all. That's what I wanted to point out. But we get to the Aguna next week. We'll pick it up. Okay. Thank you all then.
Thank you, everyone. See you all next week, hopefully. And if you want to learn more with Drisha tonight, we have one more class at 7 p.m., the Renee and Alexander Bohm Memorial Lecture, which you can sign up for at the link below. The topic for this year is Nature and the Supernatural in Medieval Ashkenaz with Dr. David Shayevitz. And if you would like to sign up, the link is available in chat. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining. Have a good evening, a good afternoon, or a good morning, wherever you are.